He shut the door, stood on the toilet and looked over the top of the cubicle and said, "What's this?" As soon as he said that, the door burst open again and these 4 hooded figures came in and they started walking around me, slowly. And as they were walking around me, one of them would punch me, headbutt me. As this was going on, the guy was looking down at me, asking me questions, and I became convinced that I wasn't going to leave there in one piece. I sort of fell into undercover work and sort of drugs obsessive policing, really, because there was the biggest moral panic in the United Kingdom about drugs going on. And that moral panic was about crack cocaine, because the newspapers had been publishing these stories for years, really, about the crack epidemic in the United States and what a catastrophe it's going to be as soon as it hits the streets of Britain. The government instructed all the police forces to prioritise, above anything else, the investigation of heroin and crack cocaine, above anything, domestic violence or any other kind of thing. And so that's how I ended up being given £20 and pointed to this blue terraced house door in the city of Derby and knocking on that door and asking to buy my first deal of drugs for the police.
Was it scary?
The first time, yeah, my stomach was doing somersaults. I was certainly nervous, but I didn't give myself a chance to get scared, particularly. And to be fair, it wasn't that difficult because this guy didn't know me. I just knocked on this door, and he said to me, "Who are you then? You're not a student, are you? You hate students." And at that moment, I thought, hang on, I don't know what I am. I haven't made up a cover story or anything. So I thought, well, that'll do. I says, yeah, I'm a student. And this woman behind him said, "God, is he stupid? You've just told him you hate students." But then he laughed and he says, "Yeah, but what fool would admit to being one now?" And so he says, "Yeah, so what do you want then?" And I said, "I'll have a £20 stone." It was actually not difficult that day, not really, because he didn't know that the police were using that tactic. But of course he went to jail, and then everyone suddenly did know that the police were using new tricks. And so in order to have a successful operation from that point onwards, it had to take a lot more effort and constantly adapting.
You're now a undercover narcotics policeman. What does a day look like?
The beginning of an operation, for the first few weeks, I would be spending time building my legend, making the connections, working out who it is that I can use to best introduce me further up the ladder. Who's got those contacts. It's all about finding out who knows who and who's useful. But in terms of practically what I did for the start of the day, well, I realised that it was particularly useful for me to dress down and actually look like I fit in with the street community, the people who are homeless or living in squats, the people who are really living on the edge of society. If I looked like them, I could fit in with them quicker.
What happens to you in the field if you're offered some drugs?
Well, I mean, there were occasions when I had to use drugs undercover. There were. A small amount of times when I used cannabis, but it's just cannabis, isn't it? There was a time when I had to use amphetamine, and that's because this person who'd given it to me, I made this really stupid mistake by basically making myself out to be a connoisseur of amphetamines, and I'm clearly not. But this person gave me this amphetamine and he says, "Wow, I bet you've never had anything like this." And I thought, no, how right you are. But I had this moment of reticence on my face, which I knew he'd picked up on. And I saw this split second of suspicion at my reticence. So I thought, well, I'm going to have to throw water on this fire of suspicion instantly to put it out, which meant that I had to enthusiastically dip my finger in this bag and show willing. And this amphetamine in this bag, this pink toxic-looking goo in this little Sealy bag, would turn out to be incredibly strong. It was 40% pure, as opposed to what was normally 5% pure at that time in the market. And it smelt like the urine from a glue-sniffing cat, that sort of urine-y, toxic smell. And I sort of almost felt the mouthfeel sort of forming on my tongue as I had it. And because I didn't have any tolerance, it meant I was completely out of it. I was absolutely destroyed. And it was not a comfortable experience at all. I knew enough about it. I wasn't going to have an overdose, but it was well beyond a comfortable dose. I was very anxious indeed. And so I had to get driven home, and I didn't actually sleep properly for 3 nights. Didn't sleep at all for the first 2 nights. That's how strong it was. Mind you, my house has never been so tidy, I can tell you.
Could you talk us through your biggest case?
Yeah, I suppose my biggest case is that against the Burger Bar boys in Northampton. This operation was sold to me. I was talked into it, and they said, Woodsy, we need you to do this job because this gang are using sexual violence to intimidate people. They're gang raping people. They're doing all the normal kind of gangster stuff, kidnappings, maimings, and all of that kind of thing. But they're also, they're just for reputation building, they're using sexual violence. And there were 6 of them that had taken over the heroin and crack cocaine supply in Northampton, using violence to do that. One of them was implicated, and I saw some of the intelligence on this, one of them was implicated in 7 different murders in Birmingham, and he was apparently responsible for sourcing the machine guns for the murder of Letitia Shakespeare and Charmaine Harris, I think in 2004. It'll be, I think. And so they were a really dangerous gang, and so I thought, okay, I need to work and try and catch these people. And up until that point, I was buying heroin off people, but what I would do is I would moan and complain, saying the bags aren't big enough, it's not good enough. I need a hookup right to the main people, and eventually managed to get that introduction. And I'll never forget the day I got that intro. I was taken to where they were sort of holding court, their sort of local headquarters in the snooker club, right in the centre of Northampton. Straight into the gents' toilets, and I was stood there for a few minutes, and the guy who was going to be introducing me was looking terrified over to my left, and then the door burst open, and this hooded figure walked in, and he went into the cubicle. He shut the door, stood in the toilet, and looked over the top of the cubicle and said, "What's this?" As soon as he said that, the door burst open again, and these 4 hooded figures came in, and they started walking around me, slowly. And as they were walking around me, one of them would punch me, headbutt me. I think it was a headbutt on the side of the head, right on my ear. So it really hurt. And then a few seconds later, one of them would punch me in the ribs, or push me, and then that would, on the other side, the other one would punch me. And as this was going on, the guy was looking down at me, asking me questions, and then asking my mate questions, and then rephrasing the same question, trying to catch me out. And he was asking how long we'd known each other, and of course my mate had made me learn a cover story to say that we'd known each other for much longer, which is really confusing when you're an undercover cop you've got a cover story and you just had to learn a new one on top of it. And I became convinced that I wasn't going to leave there in one piece because it was hurting, and I knew their capacity for extreme violence, and I just thought it was just going to explode any moment. Anyway, eventually he said to me, "All right then, what do you want?" And I looked up at him and said, "I'll have 1-on-1, please." Polite as you like. And I handed him £40, and he gave me a 0.4 of heroin and a 0.4 of crack. And that was the most important moment for the operation, really, because we exchanged phone numbers. He put me in his memory. And from that day onwards, I started gathering evidence of conspiracy against the whole gang, and I bought from all of them. And I carried on doing for months. And more than any other operation, certainly from that point onwards, I was constantly in fear when I was operating, when I was out on the streets, constantly in fear of immediate violence, that it could happen at any time, because they'd never let up on the intimidation and just that sense of imminent violence. The development of that kind of undercover work and the procedures developed really quickly, although there was no training for it for the first 4 years at all. If I wanted to, if a constabulary or special operations team wanted to use an operative, then I would be loaned to them. That team would have to be completely cocooned, completely separate from normal policing operations, totally separate. And in fact, by the end of the 1990s, before any operation started, that team would be briefed. They would be told, you must not ask the undercover operative their real name. You must not ask them where they're from, and you will be disciplined if you do. Now, the reason for that is to protect my safety. And the reason that they had to do that with fellow cops is because it didn't take too long to realise that corruption was a massive problem with drugs investigations, that information leaked. And obviously information leaking when you've got an undercover operative on the ground, that's potentially extremely dangerous, potentially fatal. So those systems were put in place to protect my anonymity, so which it became a very lonely place really, because I was using the same pseudonym to the problematic drug users and the gangsters on the street as I was to my police colleagues. No one even knew my real name, and that was to protect my safety, which I can tell you is not particularly reassuring if that's the best they can do for systems to protect you.
Would it be fair to say that the police accept that there is internal corruption?
The fact that those systems are in place is in itself proof that the corruption exists. There is only a need for those safeguards if that corruption is a problem. Those systems are an acceptance of that corruption.
What were the drug addicts that you met like?
When I went into the police, I had a very stigmatised view of people who had a problem with drugs. I looked down on them. I did. I didn't know. I just saw them as people who had made a mistake, stupid enough to try the drugs in the first place, and didn't have the mental willpower to get themselves out of it. But when I started working undercover, I realised the people I had to get to know were those people who were struggling with problematic heroin or crack cocaine use, or both. And I realised actually that they were a massive selection of people. And I realised that they were where they were because of what had happened to them, or more often than not, what had been done to them. And I realised that they were vulnerable people who were struggling, who needed help. I understand, I learned that fairly quickly, and I was very keen to keep learning about these people, really for selfish reasons though, because if I understood their motivations, how they worked, what made them tick, it could make me a better undercover officer. And I very cynically manipulated them, and I picked on the most vulnerable people. I sought out and I looked for the most vulnerable people, because the most vulnerable are the easiest to manipulate. And that's the game I was in. But there were many really nice people and thoughtful people and intelligent people who had just ended up where they were for circumstances out of their control. I remember in Northampton, it was a woman who went by the name of Uma. And one day, just because to try and offset some suspicion, I was playing rattling. I was having a day where I was making out I didn't have much money. And as soon as she saw me, she said, "Oh, mate, you're hanging out, aren't you? You're struggling." And I went, yeah. And she reached into her pocket and she handed me a £5. And I says, "But hang on, you're going to need that, aren't you?" She says, "No, it's fine. You know, I've just had a hit. I'm going to be all right for a good few hours. I've got time to earn some back, but you need it now. You need it more than me." And I've never come across such pure generosity anywhere, because she needed that to avoid her pain and to feel better. But she just empathised with me, or how she perceived me to be, that I was rattling, that I was in pain. And so her first response, without a thought, was to give me that money. It was incredible. And one day she told me, Uma, she said, "Well, I can stop taking heroin anytime I want. And actually every few weeks I do. I take a fortnight's break to bring down my tolerance, so it's easier to maintain the habit." She says, "But the trouble is, when I stop taking heroin, I become suicidal. Because then I remember the feeling of my uncle's fingernails as he sexually abused me as a little girl. And that's why she stayed on heroin, to block out that emotional pain. Sometimes, for some operations, it felt like I was on the wrong side, quite frankly.
Was it the same for the sellers as well?
Most dealers of heroin and crack cocaine are people who are being exploited by organised crime. They are being exploited and pushed into dealing, and they're pushed into finding new customers. But they're pushed into it because they've got their own habit. And of course, they're exploited because if they deal for the organised crime gangs, the actual gangsters, then they get their supply free. And yet these people, who are the dealers, are treated as dealers by the courts and get extraordinarily long sentences when actually they need rescuing from that exploitation and they need help. There's one particular dealer, if you can call him a dealer. He was a 16-year-old and he was part of this gang that I got into and I was buying regularly off. When I met him, he was 16 and he was actually one of the nicer ones. I could have a laugh with him. He was good fun. He was a bit cheeky. And I saw him change from a fun-loving 16-year-old to a terrifying 17-year-old over the space of 6 months. And the reason he changed, and changed so rapidly, is because the group that he was with made it clear to him how you had to behave to survive in that world. Because by policing drugs, by having undercover cops like me in that marketplace, or police informants in that marketplace, it creates a Darwinian situation where the ones who are successful, who don't get caught, who don't get grassed up, they're the ones who are prepared to be the most ruthless, who can show extreme violence to intimidate people.
Can we get on to why you decided to quit eventually?
Even though I knew I was causing harm to vulnerable people, I justified that harm because I saw it that the end justifies the means. That because I was going to catch these gangsters at the end of the operation, the harm I was going to cause to individuals was justified. For every passing year, the streets got more dangerous. And it got more dangerous because of the presence of people like me in that marketplace. And these people become more violent and they turn it into an art form even. Because that's how you don't get caught. And the harder we police this, the more we sharpen that sword. The more we encourage that brutality by forcing that competition on the streets. But the problem is, police never reduced the size of the market. It actually happened in the 1990s when all of those resources were directed into drugs policing by the Home Office. Twice the resources, twice as many, twice the prison sentences. Prisons filled up. But the market's never reduced. The size of the market never shrinks. So more often than not, especially in our inner cities, successful drugs policing increases violence. I realised I couldn't be in the police anymore, and this conflict. I was also starting to have a breakdown because of my PTSD, a profound sense of guilt for the harm that I'd caused to individuals. I had to get out, and because I have this knowledge and this experience, I am duty-bound to try and explain it to the public. Because if the public understood these things, the public would insist of their politicians that we change policy.
And if you could just summarise what the word is to be spread, what would that be?
We must end this war on drugs. We must end drug prohibition. And by that, I don't just mean the decriminalisation of people who use drugs. Of course we should stop criminalising people who use drugs. But what I mean is I'm looking at this through a police lens. We need to take this power away from organised crime. We have to take the drug markets away from criminals. We have to legally regulate drugs to take the power away from organised crime, to save lives and make a safer society. And I'd like to actually address any police out there who's listening to this, and I would encourage you to also turn the blind eye. I would encourage you to decide not to ruin some young person's life by arresting them and putting them into the criminal justice system for possession of drugs, because it does ruin people's lives. I would encourage you to turn a blind eye. I would encourage you to ignore your orders in that regard. You know, as this movement carries on, as this movement grows internationally amongst police, the movement who want to stop this war on drugs, then there will be more people inclined to stand up to those orders. There will be more people inclined to refuse to criminalise young people like that. Now, I know that police now have diversion schemes. Many police, they don't have to arrest, they don't have to prosecute people, they don't have to put people into the criminal justice system. They can divert them to health systems. But where you don't have diversion schemes, I'm encouraging dissent.
I had to strip down to next to nothing and grease up, put a towel over the cut section of bar of the window so it wouldn't scratch my back, and levered myself out, while Sten wrenched that up just another little inch, probably strangling everybody he'd always hated since childhood, but just enough for me to get out.